those need to come out. Where would they go? I don't know. Because they actually hold stuff every meeting. Is it? Oh, wow. I don't know. I don't have a watch. And you're watching. You're not taking notes.
Good evening. The Thursday, February 27th, 2020 regular meeting of the Brisbane Planning Commission will now come to order. May I have roll call, please?
Commissioner Gooding?
Here.
Commissioner Mackin?
Here.
Commissioner Patel? Here. Commissioner Sison?
Here.
The record reflect Commissioner Gomez is absent.
Adoption of the agenda. May I have a motion to adopt, please?
So moved.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Consent calendar. Is there anyone who would like to remove an item from the consent calendar for further discussion? I see no one. May I have a motion to adopt, please?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Next is oral communications. And Michelle Salmon would like to speak.
Michelle Salmon, Brisbane resident. Hi. I don't come to the Planning Commission meeting often, but one of the things, I'm here for various other reasons, but one of the things that does concern me is the Planning Commission often grants exceptions and variances and approvals with conditions. And this has been a long history in Brisbane. And I'm concerned because I don't see a mechanism consistent for enforcement of those conditions that you put on variances and conditions, and by you, I mean the Planning Commission for the last several years, not just you in particular. But one of the things that came to mind recently is the Google bus lot with the more than bright light shining up into the sky of what I thought would be, according to the plan, solar lights. I can't believe solar generates quite that much radiant light. And the amount of dust kicked up in the parking lot and the amount of safety. And I think it is very unsafe on Tunnel Road to have that. I think the concrete blocks need to be removed so that people do have an area to ditch if they need to, if a Google bus is cutting them off or someone else is cutting them off or someone's illegally passing, which I used to see all the time. I don't thankfully commute that way anymore. But I looked to see what the final determination was for your recommendations. I saw what was proposed, never saw a final copy of what you agreed to with the Google buses, but the lighting is absolutely horrible. It really completely lights up the night sky. And it is a concern because over the years I've seen many variances granted for many things and then no follow-up to make sure that the conditions of the variances were met. And I could give you a laundry list of examples, but I don't need to right now. My big concern is that the conditions under which the Google buses were approved gets enforced. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for all your consideration and hard work. I know it's not an easy job at all.
Thank you. And on the issue of the Google buses, I do want to say that we are aware of that issue, and staff has been in contact with Google and UPC. So they're working to resolve that issue, and I would like to address with staff about calendaring an update.
Perhaps we could do that at the commission items portion of the agenda.
Okay, so we'll calendar that for a future meeting. Okay, is there anyone else who would like to address the commission about an item that's not on tonight's agenda? Okay, I see no one. I'll move to written communications. We have a publication here from the Bay Area Monitor for February and March 2020. And I have several letters here concerning the issue of the short-term rentals. I won't go into all of it right now, but we will take that into consideration. Okay, so the next item on the agenda is our public hearing. and that concerns grading review EX-4-19, 338 Kings Road, R-1 Residential District. This concerns grading review for approximately 330 cubic yards of soil cut and export to accommodate a new driveway, attached garage, and additions for an existing single-family dwelling on a 6,400 square foot lot with a 43% slope. Abraham Zavala is the applicant, and Wang John and Chen Joy Trust are the owners. Staff, may we have a report?
Yes, thank you, Chair and Commission. So the request before you tonight is for a grading review of a project to excavate approximately 330 cubic yards of soil from the subject property at 338 Kings. The excavation would accommodate a new garage where there is no current garage or any parking on the site, as well as an expanded driveway. And just a reminder, the Planning Commission does have a threshold for review of any grading projects that remove 50 cubic yards of soil or more from a site or involve 250 cubic yards of combined cut and fill. Following Commission review, the city engineer requires a full grading permit application to be submitted with geotechnical feasibility studies, engineering, and other technical studies prior to actually issuing the permit. So the subject property is approximately 6,400 square feet. It's developed with an existing two-level 1,740 square foot single-family dwelling with non-conforming front and east side setbacks, and again, no on-site parking. You can see the existing structure here on the site plan and those non-conforming setbacks. As is pretty common in a lot of our hillside neighborhoods, the property line is actually about 10 to 15 feet behind or beyond the lane of travel on Kings Road. So there's a significant portion of the right-of-way that is not improved, that it appears as hillside. And the property is currently accessed via an on-grade stairway in the right-of-way. There is a curb cut in the frontage of the property that provides driveway access to the adjacent property at 334 Kings. The driveway does pass over the subject property in addition to being located wholly in its frontage. So there's a existing easement that benefits the neighbors to the west at 334 Kings. To highlight a couple things, here shown mostly in purple is the extent of the 40-foot right-of-way. So again, Kings Road, while it certainly is not paved to the full 40-foot extent, it is 40 feet wide in terms of the right-of-way. And here showing in green, again, is the footprint of the existing driveway that is, again, largely within the right-of-way in front of the subject property, currently serving the property next door. And here's some photos of the site. Here, this portion of the access stairway is, again, almost entirely within the public right-of-way, and this portion of the driveway here. This street tree, you'll see as I follow the presentation in a few minutes, will have to be removed as part of the driveway widening. And there's another view there of the existing driveway where it terminates at 334 Kings. So again, the project proposes excavation and export of 330 cubic yards of soil from the subject property. Additional excavation is proposed in the right-of-way. That's not in the scope of the Commission's review in this application, but obviously it's all part of the same project. The excavation on the property would be to accommodate the footprint of a new garage that would accommodate 2 covered parking spaces, as well as a second-level addition to create an accessory dwelling unit, and then some additions at the 3rd level to the main dwelling, with the remainder of the 3rd level being dedicated as a roof deck and not enclosed floor area. So essentially a 2-level addition. The work within the public right-of-way would include a new on-street parking space here. Currently, again, this is hillside, so this would have to be a retained parking space in the street. can't be dedicated for private use, but we could credit that as a parking spot for compliance with zoning regulations for this property. But again, this would be a public parking space. A second on-street space would be located in the driveway tandem to the garage. The city engineer is also requiring improvement of 2 street spaces that already exist across the street. They don't quite meet city standards, so they would be improved to comply with city standards as part of this project. And again, at least 1 street tree would need to be removed as it falls within the proposed footprint of the expanded driveway. Removal of street trees is subject to approval by the city engineer. Of course, it is something that the commission considers in their action on the application, but ultimately it's per the city engineer's discretion. So highlighted here is the city engineer's required widened 20-foot travel way. So right now, the actual paved portion of Kings that you drive on isn't quite 20 feet, so the applicant would have to widen that to 20 feet clear. Again, I've highlighted those parking space improvements in the right-of-way as well. And the footprint of the new expanded driveway is shown here. So the new curb cut would be about 34 feet. It would allow for completely clear access for both properties. It would retain the existing easement would be retained and would not be impacted. So the property at 334 Kings would still maintain clear access and would not be prevented from entering or leaving the property. And here is the grading plan. So this shows the footprint of excavation as well as the volume. So again, this is the footprint of the addition here with some expansion under the existing home. And then moving into the public right-of-way, the excavation there for the on-street parking space and for the new access stairway to the property. And this has, of course, all been reviewed by the city engineer, and he is agreeable to the improvements in the public right-of-way. Of course, the design will be refined and finalized at the grading permit level, but he's signed off onto the general concept. Building and Fire have also reviewed these plans as well and imposed conditions of approval. So the Planning Commission adopted guidelines for the grading reviews several years ago. They relate to minimizing the grading that's proposed and ensuring the design reflects the natural topography of the site. So in this case, we have a unique, there's a situation that's actually on a lot of properties where, again, the private property is both several feet beyond and elevated above the street. So that automatically constrains access, driveway access. So considering those constraints, the grading is the minimum necessary to provide required on-site parking and safe access to both 338 and 334 Kings. Another finding is that the design avoids large retaining walls. There is a 10-foot wall proposed to retain the new stairway. That is mostly in the right-of-way, but does partially encroach in the front yard setback. There's a condition of approval in the resolution for vegetative screening or different materials to break up the massing of that wall. There's the other wall is also in the right-of-way to retain the new parking space. Same condition, recommending that the city engineer incorporate screening or different materials into that wall to lessen the visual impact. The third finding is that it avoids tree removal. The design conserves trees. So again, as noted, there is an oak tree in the right-of-way that is within the footprint of the driveway widening that will have to be removed. There's another oak tree adjacent to it that seems like it'll be able to be saved, but as the grading plans are refined, there's a potential to impact that tree as well. So the recommendation in the resolution before you is for the city engineer to collect an in lieu fee for the one tree that is going to have to be removed to fund a replacement tree planted elsewhere in the community, hopefully in the vicinity. But again, that's to the city engineer's discretion ultimately. And the last finding regards Habitat Conservation Plan compliance, which is not applicable here. So that concludes my report. Staff is recommending that the Commission adopt Resolution EX4-19 recommending the city engineer issue the grading permit subject to the conditions in the resolution. I'll answer any questions.
Thank you. Does anyone have questions for staff? Commissioner Mackin?
Thank you. Julia, first question, what is the parking requirement for this house? We understand there is no parking available for the house, but what is the requirement?
So the current square footage of the home, again, about 1740. The current requirement would be 2 on-site spaces, one of which has to be covered. So it's currently non-compliant. With the project, it would increase the size of the home to exceed 1,800 square feet. Once you exceed 1,800 square feet, your parking requirement jumps to 4 spaces, 2 of which have to be covered. Our zoning ordinance allows projects to accommodate half of their uncovered parking requirement, basically 2 spaces in the frontage of the property within the street. So the project as designed would comply with that 4-space requirement with 2 in the garage and 2 new on-street parking spaces.
And are there 2 on-street parking spaces? I assume you're referring to the ones across the street?
Currently, no. Well, yes. Currently, there is no on-street parking on the side of the street adjacent to this property.
Right.
It's a hillside right now. There are 2 spaces across the street. We can't count those spaces for meeting the parking requirement in the zoning.
Okay.
The city engineer is requiring those spaces to be improved because of all of the other widening activity that's happening, but they're not meeting the parking requirement for the house.
Okay. And the street being widened, is this because of the work being done, or would this have been mandated by the city engineer were this project not taking place?
Well, if you're not doing the project, then no, that we wouldn't require street widening without the nexus of a project.
Okay. And the present curb cut is, do you have an idea how much that is?
We do, I believe it's about 20 feet. There's a dimension here. The driveway itself is, I mean, it varies in width. It's about 12 feet. So yeah, that looks to me more like about maybe 18. So the curb cut would be extended significantly.
Okay. And the driveway widening, is that being mandated, or is that a design decision to come up with a 33-foot curb cut?
It's, I think, a design requirement because this is a shared driveway now. It's not just serving one property. That this is the width necessary to make sure that both residents of both properties have clear access.
So when you say the width necessary, are you talking about the curb cut or the driveway width?
Both, they go together.
Okay, so it's not selectively being chosen to be a wide driveway as an option, in other words.
I think the applicant can probably speak more to the engineering requirements and the requirements for, again, the easement, which takes up, oh, this might be hard to see, but the easement takes up quite a bit of the existing driveway. And again, that's area of the driveway that, while it's on the property of 338, the property owner of 338 cannot obstruct, cannot use. It's basically a dead space that has to be maintained clear.
Okay.
But yeah, the engineer can certainly answer more questions about that.
Okay, and then final question. So I understand there's a historic easement by the house to the right in order to access their property on this 12-foot wide driveway. If the subject house wanted to add additional parking and a garage, would it be mandated to be partnering off this existing driveway, or could it have been located elsewhere?
Again, I think the engineer can speak to different design concepts,
Okay.
but just from a logistical standpoint, there's already a curb cut there. This is a very steep area. I think having 2 driveways in a very short distance of each other, one may not have met the requirements in Title 12 for new driveways and the distances we require between them, but also would potentially have more grading involved than what we're seeing here. But the engineer can walk you through the different design options they considered.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, I will open the public hearing now, and may we hear from the applicant, please?
Good evening. My name is Abraham Sabala, and I'm the project engineer. I think that Ms. Cyrus described the project very accurate and what we're trying to do. I will not add more to that. However, I'm open to questions, either right now or later.
Are you going to make a presentation?
No, because I think that Ms. Cyrus described the project, what we are trying to do.
Okay.
We are trying to accommodate, and to me, we'll be repeating the same thing again.
Okay, so I'd like to ask you about the tree removal adjacent to this driveway. And had you considered any other configuration of this driveway in order to preserve that? Because that is a heritage protected tree. And I've been looking at this and going, why didn't they put the driveway a little more to the left? They could have put the garages more towards the middle. I mean, I'm not an architect and I'm not pretending to be, but just my layman's eye looking at this, I didn't understand, because then this driveway is still in the public right-of-way, which if we're trying to correct a historic use of the public right-of-way, you're still using a lot of the public right-of-way, but in a different sense.
Well, the driveway is existing.
Yes.
All we are doing is widening that driveway, and part of the problem is the easement that is kind of encroaches. And right now, the existing driveway uses more of the easement to get access to the house next door. The only option in this case is to widen that driveway, because also the topography next to the house, it will make it impossible to set that. I mean, to relocate that driveway.
Okay, I understand the preservation of the driveway, but the configuration where you've put the garages necessitates widening it at the right side of the house, as opposed to if you put the garages more towards the center of the house, you go straight from the street right in underneath the house, as opposed to making this very wide paved area, which isn't really benefiting the next door neighbor. They could still have their 12-foot wide driveway, but it seems like it would actually be easier to be able to go from the street right underneath the house if the garages were more towards the middle. That's where I'm questioning.
I mean, won't be easier, because just the difference in elevation from the street to the let's say the first floor or the garage level.
Right.
Going straight to the house will imply to create a new driveway next to the existing one.
Well, I don't mean creating a whole separate driveway. I mean just instead of this being wide angled, that you have theirs and then this comes here and goes in under the house.
Well, the reason of making that driveway wider is because we need to back up from the proposed garage, and really there is no other way to do this.
Okay, I'll just have to take your word for what you said. So, in the process of designing this, did you look at trying to preserve the tree?
Yes, we did. Initially, the tree was not supposed to be removed, but later on, once that we start going into details, we have to remove the tree.
Okay, and
that's the only option to widen the driveway.
Okay, because when I look at the plans, I don't see the tree trunk on top of the new driveway. So
no, the tree is going to be removed or proposed to be removed.
Okay, so you're talking the one that's now going to be near the center line of Kings Road.
Right.
Okay, with the remaining one to the right of the driveway.
The other one will stay. There
Okay.
are two trees.
Okay, so could you tell us then, we had a notation that the other one may also have to be removed. Why is that?
We set the notation because maybe that is a leftover from the very beginning.
Right.
When we were working on the driveway, because we were back and forth. Initially, the driveway was to be a little bit narrower, but then once that we add the additional parking spot next to the stairs, that create the need to have a little bit extra widened driveway.
Okay, so am I correct in reading your blueprints that you've got a brand new roof deck on the right side of the house?
Correct.
Okay. Was there consideration in these trees and the location of the garages that these trees were obstructing the views from the
No.
roof deck?
Not at all.
None at all?
Not at all.
Okay. That's all I have.
Okay, I just wanted to follow up just quickly. So what you're telling us is you're pretty confident that the second tree will not have to be removed.
I'm confident.
Okay.
Correct.
Okay. Anybody else have questions? No? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Is there anyone who would like to speak on this issue? Mr. Premlal?
Greetings, everyone. Prem Lal, Brisbane resident. My concern with this project is more about how the current owner is treating the property and how it could affect the neighbors. For instance, in April of last year, I live 2 houses down the mountainside from this property. In April of last year, the current owner's representatives, whoever they may have been, turned on a hose and left it on for about 5 days. And the water trickled all the way down from Kings to Humboldt and ended up in my gutter, coming out underneath my house. And to me, that really doesn't show very much responsibility. And that leads me to really wonder whether with all of this land removal and soil removal, there is going to be a kind of irresponsibility with regard to the stability of the mountainside. And I'm not the only one who's concerned about this. The next door neighbor is also concerned about this and has mentioned it on Facebook, to the sense that they promised to fix this mess, but nothing has happened. I am sure it would be flipped and sold. She was talking about the problems with the property next door, which is this property. So I am very concerned that removing approximately 1 million pounds of soil from the mountainside for the purpose of this project will destabilize the mountainside, and considering what happened back in April, that is a concern to me. Okay.
Thank you. Anyone else? Barbara Ebel?
Hi, Barbara Ebel, longtime Brisbane resident and professed tree hugger. I want to thank our engineer for providing the solution in his comments. It looks like that I wish I had a pointer. Is it point? Okay. So this section of the driveway is not being widened a great deal, but it is widening it enough to take out that tree. And he said the purpose for this is so that the cars have backing room out of the garage. Well, rather than take out a heritage tree, because that is a heritage tree with a 28-inch trunk, I would propose that the applicant modify their project and move the garage back a few feet, which is going to will probably increase the amount of grading they have to do, the amount of soil removed, because they'll be a little further into the mountain. But it would save our tree. You would still have adequate backing room. You would have a greater distance over which to accomplish the change in elevation, probably decreasing the slope. Can't say exactly because it wasn't clear to me from the elevations, because the elevations don't include the tree that's being removed. I must strenuously object to the loss of this tree. Coast live oaks are a heritage tree in Brisbane. They're extremely slow growing. Most of the trees that get replanted are of small stature. It's very difficult to get a big tree back in. So I would ask that you do not approve this application as it is submitted. and that they either move the garage back or find another solution to preserve the tree. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anyone else? Michelle?
I did mark it on my slip.
Oh, you did.
Yeah. There was multiple choice there. What year was this house built? I'm really curious about that, because if it was built after we became a city, they probably got a parking variance, because it has no parking whatsoever. But I'm really concerned about the plans here. That taking out 1 million pounds of dirt and rock and soil will absolutely change the hydrology and the support structure of the mountain there. That is a massive excavation, especially this high up on the mountain. And so has a qualified soils engineer been consulted? Has a qualified hydrologist been consulted on this? And this is a serious amount of excavation. Just on our street, 15 years ago, they excavated a huge amount of dirt right across the street from us to build a house there. And they built a 30-some-odd, 40-foot, I don't know, French drain retaining wall, yada, yada. And they have constant pumps, otherwise their elevator shaft fills up with water. But it not only changed the hydrology for that street, and there's always water on the street even in the summer because there's a natural spring there, but it caused flooding in the basement of the house next door to us that was built in 1940, 41, 42, and it never flooded until they built that house. So it really does impact downhill. It's all linked together. So I'm very, very concerned about the amount of dirt that they're removing and the engineering on this. And I'm concerned about it destabilizing the house that's there and having that cause it to come down the hill. I just think it really needs to be looked at a lot closer. This is a street that already has a lot of challenges, and then I also am a tree hugger. I hate the thought of losing a heritage tree of that age and that size and that statured. And you can call it a street tree, but it wasn't planted as a street tree. It is a native tree that has been there longer than I've been here, which is a really long time now. So, I wouldn't rush into this, and I would really see the geologic reports, the soils engineer's report, and a hydrology report before you proceed with this, especially a hydrology report. I mean, because we've seen what water can do in Brisbane. We've seen the mountain slide all the way from the very top of the mountain all the way down back in 1982 during the heavy rains. This is a soil type, a lattisol, clay lattisol that can absorb 3 times its weight in water and get super saturated, and then it slides. And so I am concerned about taking out that amount of structural soil and rock. That's my thoughts on it. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Please.
Good evening, Joe Sully, longtime Brisbane resident. I just wanted to say that I like the commissioner's idea of just excavating right under the front of the house, putting the garage under there, and in you go. Michelle, boy, I own property on the same block, and it was new construction across the street from my 1938 house that caused my downstairs legal apartment to flood. I've owned that house for 51 years, and after 30, 40 years, all of a sudden the new houses went in across the street, and like Michelle says, on Sierra Point, we have water running there year round, and when they built those houses, excavate into the hillside, that water ended up in my downstairs apartment. And maybe that's going to happen with this project here. You're going to cut down, you're going to get into water, and it's going to wash out the other side of the street. Anyway, I just wanted to say that I like your idea of excavating right in, put a big steel beam up, hold it up. Thank you very much, and save our trees, definitely.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, I see no one. May I have a motion to close the public hearing? All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, so I just have a question for staff. So a few people brought up the issue about destabilization of the hillside, flooding and whatnot. So is it correct that the city engineer would be considering all that before he would approve a building permit?
Yes, that's part of the grading permit review that he will undertake. Those issues for your particular review of the grading, I think Julia went through what the findings are that your legal purview are under the zoning code. So yes, those issues will be addressed as part of the grading permit review by the city engineer.
Anyone else?
And do we know at this point what studies or investigations have been done by the applicant for hydrology and that sort of thing?
I defer to the applicant if you're interested via his.
We do have a soil report, and as per the soil report, the project is feasible. We can ask him for more information about hydrology, but as per his report, the project is feasible.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Commissioner Patel.
What alternative, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to ask you to come back up again. What alternative designs did you explore that would save the 2 trees that are in front?
Well, the part of the problem is that we have a driveway that basically serves another property,
Yeah.
and there is an easement in place, and will be really hard to, even if we eliminate the easement, given access to the house next door, will be almost impossible because the distance and elevation between their garage and the street level, the slope for a new driveway will be so steep, and that's why we have to play with the fact that we already have a driveway, and use that as the access for the new garage and also serve the existing house.
So decreasing the size of the roof terrace would not help?
Not at all.
Why is that?
Because the garage is certain size, and the terrace is just a projection of the footprint of the garage, and it's just the roof.
So have you minimized the space, the garage space? Have you used the minimum?
All we have besides the parking spot for 2 cars is an elevator to go to the house, to the top of the house.
Okay.
That's pretty much what it is.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Mackin? Okay. Well, any more questions for staff? Okay, so you want to discuss, or do I have a motion? Go ahead.
I really don't like the idea of, well, there's multiple things. So one, I don't like the discretion that the engineer has in terms of whether or not the tree needs to be replaced or whether there's a fine in lieu. I think definitely that that discretion should be taken away if we grant this permit, and it should definitely be that if we do grant this permit that the tree needs to be replaced or there is an in lieu fee without any discretion. Does that make sense? And then the second thing is the applicant says that there are no alternative designs that would, or alternate designs that would save the tree. I'm going to take his word for it. I'm hoping that there aren't any alternate designs that would save the tree. And then the third thing I had was, I mean, ideally there would be a design that would save both trees, because it is a really slow-growing tree. It's really hard to get a tree that size, even if you plant it in lieu. And there is the other thing I have is, I know that it says that there's 2 street parking spaces that are going to be created. my experience with a situation where there's a design like this is basically you're going to get the house having 2 parking spots for the garage, and then they're going to claim that that one that's in the driveway area is their personal parking space. So it doesn't really help the community in any way, even though they are getting a taking of community property in lieu of these parking spaces. So there would be some sort of designation that the 2 parking spaces, the one in the driveway especially, is somehow demarked or marked somehow that people in the community know it's a public parking space.
Yeah, I like the idea about the some sign or some marking that says public. Is that something we can do, staff, to put that in the condition?
Yes, we can recommend to the city engineer that the design of the on-street parking spaces incorporate signage that clearly indicate it's public parking, but not private.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else?
Okay. I have a problem with this, and here's why. If we had said these street trees must be preserved, I feel confident there would have been a workaround. And I think we're just a little too quick to go, well, this is kind of what they want to do. And, oh, well, the tree's going to have to go. And, oh, well, the hydrology, we don't know, and maybe it won't happen anyway, or the geology. We've seen slippage up on Kings Road recently. We've had drought cycles, we've had wet cycles, and when it's wet, it's now really wet, so we have extremes. So all that soil is moving back and forth. I think there's other ways to resolve this. Retain the tree. We're still encroaching on the public right-of-way. And I just think sometimes it's time to say, you know, let's look at another way to resolve this. Let's not just go, oh, this is what they want, this is what they want to do internally, and oh well, everything has to change now on the street because of it. So I'm not willing to accept that this is the only solution to this project. I'm just not ready to accept that.
I agree with that. I think it's not unreasonable for us to ask the applicant to come up with alternative design that preserves that, and also it's a way to take less right of way than currently. That also would be desirable.
Yeah, I thought I heard the applicant say that at one point they did consider keeping both trees. Am I correct? Okay, so there was some thinking into preserving both trees at one point.
Well, initially, we were not considering adding 2 more parking spaces on the street, and that's why the driveway was narrower. But then once that we have to deal with this situation, since we can only expand in front of the property, that's why when we start widening the driveway. And that's why is the
so you're saying the 2 or at least one of the 2 trees is going down because you're providing 2 parking spaces?
No, it's because first of all, access to the house next door, and also how to get in and out from the driveway from the garage that we are proposing.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you. Oh, you have a question?
Yeah, just a design question. Is the driveway or the curb cut being expanded because that sort of diagonal space makes it difficult to get out of the garage? Is that what you're saying?
Just to have from the street to have a good turning radius into the driveway, and from the garage to get out.
So if you weren't providing the diagonal space right in front of the garage, would the curb cut and the driveway be narrower and save that tree?
It could be possible, but it's very close to it's not just the trunk of the tree, are the roots. once that you start doing work under or cutting the roots, eventually the tree is going to die, and there is no other way to to resolve the issue. We can add another tree. We are doing landscape. We can add another tree to try to replace that. It's not the same. It's an older tree, but that could be another option.
Questions anymore?
Could I just add through the chair, should one of the spaces, a design propose only 2 on-site spaces and 1 on-street space, it would make them non-conforming for parking, which, obviously we have a use permit process to allow non-conforming parking in extraordinary situations, but just putting that out there.
Okay.
Julia, if the diagonal space was taken out, would the design change so that we could save the tree?
That's a question for Abraham.
Okay.
It's very close. Like I said, because still we have to widen the driveway a little bit. The roots, they can be 20 feet into any direction. If you do any work on the driveway and you cut those roots, nobody's going to guarantee that the tree is going to survive.
So you have a stairway that is restricting the width of the driveway there. Have you thought of moving the stairway?
This is a proposed stairway. Mm-hmm. Right now the stairway is in a different location.
Yes, I know the existing one, but this is your proposed stairway.
Correct.
Would that not help the turning radius and not be coming near that tree, because it would enable you to make the driveway go over in that area if the stairway was located somewhere else?
Well, but you have to come into the driveway from both directions. It's not just from one way. Yeah, if you are coming from north to south, from south to north, that's fine. Mm-hmm. But if you're coming on the other way, you have a problem right there.
Okay, but the house next door has been using this driveway. They've had that problem all along, and they've dealt with it.
Well,
right
now it's right there, but
right.
We don't have the new garage.
Okay. Okay, but what I'm saying is they've accessed that driveway, north and south, coming with that angle, and they have dealt with it.
Right.
To get in that driveway. Only 12 feet wide and maybe at the most 18 at the curb cut. And they have managed to live in that house and access that driveway. So they've made it work.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, but what you are saying is, it's different from what we want to do. Because
I understand
yeah,
that. It's different
and
from what you want to do.
Yeah.
I understand that. I do. I get it.
But it's possible to do it that way.
We cannot do it that way if we have the parking spots right there, and also we want to back up from the garage. The existing driveway is not wide enough to do that. To get into the garage and out of the garage, the driveway is not wide enough.
Okay, thank you. Barbara, quickly.
I want to thank the engineer on this project once again for making a point that I wanted to make. And that is that if you expand that driveway down that way towards the street, if you take out the other tree, there's nothing saying that you're not going to be damaging the roots of the other tree. You absolutely have to leave that edge of that driveway alone. And he did not answer my suggestion of possibly pushing the garage back a little further. I'm not crazy about taking 1 million pounds of soil out of the mountain either. But if you're going to permit this project, it seems to me like the marginal difference of taking a little more soil out to preserve probably both of those trees, because you're not going to guarantee that the other one's going to live once you start redoing that driveway. You have to be willing to face the possibility that you're going to lose both of them. Okay, and those trees, like Michelle said, are original trees to this mountain. They're like native trees. We built around them. We have a responsibility to continue to let them live out their natural lives. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Please, quickly.
Through the chair, are you reopening the public hearing, or is it public hearing?
I was just going to allow one more comment.
Just quickly, with regard to the trees and the stability of the mountainside, remember that the roots are keeping the soil in place, and they're also drawing water out of the soil and into the tree. So after the rains, all of the water that used to be going into those trees will be going nowhere.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Okay, so anybody want to propose a motion?
Before we try to draft a motion, I think my end take here is I would like to figure out some way for the applicant to put some more work into figuring out how to design this, save that tree, and have less. If that means losing some curb cut, so be it.
There's, Doug, if I may, there's the spot, the extra parking space in front was not there. I don't know if that could be moved down. The stairs could be moved. There's so many things, moving parts here. We're not engineers, and I think if we really would like them to go back to the drawing board, the only solution is to say we deny it tonight. You look into the hydrology, the geology, look into designs, come back to us again, honestly, because we're not going to solve that tonight.
Agreed.
Mr. Patel?
No, that's it.
Okay, so do I have a motion?
I think the motion is to deny the permit.
I'd second that.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Oh, let me read the, well, I guess I'll read the appeals process at the conclusion of the meeting. Okay, the next item on the agenda is the continuation of the public hearing that was held on January 9th concerning zoning text amendment RZ-2-19, zoning text amendments to adopt regulations for short-term residential rentals by adding a new chapter 17.35 to Brisbane Municipal Code. City of Brisbane is the applicant. Staff, may we have a report?
Yes. So this application was continued from the January 9th meeting, at which time Commission and the public posed a lot of questions that staff wanted to follow up on. So the supplemental report you got for this evening's agenda answers most of those questions that were brought up, but let's start first with a recap of what the draft regulations actually say. We'll try to do this quickly. So who may host short-term rentals? The draft ordinance would propose that only permanent residents of single-family dwellings or certain accessory dwelling units be allowed to host short-term rentals. This means that long-term tenants would be authorized with property owner approval. And it also means that accessory dwelling units could not be rented exclusively for short-term rentals by a property owner. How would a host obtain a permit? So this, as proposed in the ordinance, the zoning administrator would receive and act on any short-term rental permit. Notification will be sent to neighbors throughout the block of the application, and they would have 21 days to submit written comments. Zoning administrator would approve the application if it complied with all the ordinance regulations, if the dwelling passed a health and safety inspection, and if there were no active code enforcement cases in the past year. We should note there is a 90-day amnesty for current operators of short-term rentals to become legal, so that as long as they do it within 90 days of passage of the ordinance, they would be able to obtain the permit. Neighbors would be also notified of the action on the permit application and provided the contact information for the owner and the host and the local contact person if the unhosted rentals are proposed. The permit would be valid for 2 years. During that time, it could be suspended or revoked, depending on how many citations or code enforcement actions are issued within the certain thresholds. After the 2-year permit or period is up, a renewal would be required. They'd have to apply for their renewal. The same exact notification process to all neighbors in the block and occupants and owners would be sent out. They could provide written comments. The zoning administrator would also review the permit record and would review any sort of, in addition to citations, assuming they were cited and not suspended or revoked, any complaints or call logs that may be collected in the property file related to the host conduct. So should two citations be issued within 6 months to a short-term rental, the zoning administrator would suspend the permit for at least 30 days, if not longer, depending on how long it takes to resolve the issue. Should 3 citations occur within a 12-month period, the zoning administrator could revoke the permit. The ordinance proposes unlimited hosted rentals, meaning that the host is on site. Proposes 60 days maximum for unhosted rentals, where the host isn't present. A local contact person would need to be designated. That information for that person would be provided to all neighbors again in the vicinity of the property. So the draft ordinance has several provisions attempting to mitigate impacts to the community. First, we'll talk about 1 on-site parking space would be required per habitable room for rent. So this would have to be existing on-site parking, and existing parking would have to be made available to guests. So if anyone's parking on the street, it would be the property owner themselves. It would cap 2 rooms. Sorry? So the parking requirement for a short-term rental would be 1 space per habitable room they're renting, and that parking would have to be located on the property. And we'd be also looking at garage spaces, so the garage would have to be usable for parking. And so what that means is that if anyone would park on the street, it would be the host themselves. They would have to make sure that on-site parking is dedicated to guests. It would cap the maximum number of rooms rented at any time to 2 habitable rooms for hosted rentals. No such limitation would exist for unhosted. This is partially to, again, try to mitigate any potential parking impacts when the host is present on the property. Rooms must be rented to the same rental party, so meaning you can't have 2 rooms that you're renting to different people who aren't part of the same rental party. Guest check-in and check-out would be limited between 7 a.m. and 10 p.m. Maximum 2 overnight guests and 4 daytime guests per habitable room, excluding children. Quiet hours beginning at 10 p.m., prohibiting special events like weddings and parties. For violations of these requirements would be considered infractions under the municipal code, and there are financial penalties for infractions. The City Council has the right to adopt different higher penalties should they deem it necessary. Enforcement. Currently, existing staff would enforce the ordinance as written. So both the police department, who would be reacting to the kind of urgent, immediate complaints regarding noise, illegal parking, trash. Police would continue to be the first responders for complaints of that nature. Code enforcement and Community Development Department would also be actively engaged in any enforcement activity related to short-term rental use. It is possible that the city could hire a third-party consultant to administer and enforce the ordinance. There are vendors out there, so that is possible. And the fees for that could be offset with permit fees, or sorry, the cost for that could be offset with permit fees. So some questions at the last hearing were brought up regarding code enforcement. What's the current status? So I think as was mentioned at the January 9 hearing, in December 2014, the city sent out notices to correct to several property owners with Airbnb listings. This was a reaction to a code enforcement complaint that was submitted. In January 2015, the City Council deliberated on the issue, and at that time directed the Planning Commission to study the matter. Back in 2015, so not this current commission, the prior commission, and make recommendations to council. At that time, the council also put code enforcement on the land use issue of short-term rentals in abeyance, on hold, until such a time as a final decision was made on a policy. And that was the second letter sent out to the previously cited parties from the city that was referenced at the hearing last month. It can't be emphasized enough that quality of life issues associated with short-term rentals, like noise, like parking, like trash, anything that's a disturbance or a nuisance, is actively enforced by the police department and will continue to be. That is always going to be the appropriate party to address those kind of complaints. And in regards to inquiries or communications with the public, Short-term rentals are not currently permitted in the municipal code, right? That is what staff tells people. We are currently considering updating the municipal code to potentially allow short-term rentals in some shape or form, but they are not currently permitted. Regarding criminal activity in short-term rentals, we talked with the police chief. There's been no documented cases of criminal activity occurring in short-term rentals in Brisbane. Their calls have been limited to quality of life issues. And again, they're available 24/7 for residents for any sort of issues to report, and they are here to serve and protect us. Questions were brought up again regarding effective enforcement of the multitude of performance standards that we have in the ordinance. So how do we ensure that hosts are not doing more than 60 days of unhosted rentals? How are we ensuring that they're not renting out more than 2 rooms? Manual enforcement by existing staff is possible. It would probably be time consuming and resource intensive, but we could do it. And by we, again, I mean code enforcement, police, community development department. We regularly collaborate and coordinate with each other and share data, and again, it's possible to do so. There are vendors out there, again, who we could outsource that enforcement and monitoring to as well, at a cost to the city. So that's something for the council to consider. So that was a quick highlight. If there's any other questions before we start the public hearing, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you. Any follow-up questions for staff? Commissioner Gooding?
Yeah, I had one that's just sort of wordsmithing. I was confused, and it's on page H.1.13 under paragraph G. Let me know when you're there, and I'll ask my question. Ready?
Mm-hmm.
It says a permanent residence may be occupied as a short-term rental for no more than 60 days during an unhosted stay. Are we trying to convey that 60 days during a calendar year?
Yes.
Okay. It sounds like potentially that's 60 days for one unhosted stay, which I know nobody means to say, but I think that's kind of a little glitch in the verbiage there. Whatever we decide on the larger issues tonight, that's just a technical point. That's my only technical point. I'll yield for policy questions. I have some questions later myself.
Any others? Okay, Commissioner Mackin.
All right. Julia, please, if you would, just for everyone involved, if the guests are cited for violations, are those counting towards infractions on the dwelling as violations? Whether it's citing the owner for some infraction or the guest, those are cumulative towards citations. Yes? No?
I'm hearing yes.
The property owner, the operator, is liable for any for the guest behavior. So it's not like, well, the guest goes away, so there's no violation that would count against infractions against the property or citations against the property.
Okay. And next one. Some of my questions I'm going to wait because I don't want to get too deep into things, but permanent resident, the definition should be someone who resides in the dwelling for at least 6 months during a consecutive 12-month period. Could you give us some idea how we ended up with 6 months?
And just piggybacking off of that question, I think San Francisco's is 275 days per year.
I've researched, and different cities have more than that. That's why I'm questioning it.
It is not uncommon to have residential leases for 6 months, periods of 6 months. So we can certainly require a longer period of time, but that seemed to capture, should a long-term renter only have a 6-month lease, they would still be considered permanent residents who would be able to register as hosts. But you can certainly increase the number of days.
Okay. And on one of the pages, you talk about the dwelling unit to be offered for short-term rentals, not the subject of active code enforcement or administrative citation. Could you please define what an administrative citation is? It's on page 3 of 7.
So in Title 1 of the Municipal Code, where we talk about violations of the code, there are different, as I understand it, classifications of citations that can be cited based on the type of infraction. So that's just inclusive language that addresses any type of citation or notice to correct or any corrective action.
So that would typically come from planning?
Code enforcement.
Okay. Oh, code enforcement. All right. Moving along here, accessory dwelling units. It's noted in the draft language that short-term rentals may not operate in units established on or after April 1, 2017. However, permanent residents of accessory dwelling units legally established prior to April 1, 2017 may apply to host them. So, first question is, it was my understanding ADUs, legal ADUs, are earmarked for low and very low income. Is that correct? So a legally established unit, even if it was prior to April 1, doesn't that conflict with the definition of a legal ADU?
So first of all, when we issue permits now for accessory dwelling units, we account for them in our annual housing element report as non-deed restricted moderate income units based on rent surveys that we do every year. And perhaps I'm not capturing your question. Are you asking if allowing short-term rentals by permanent residents of ADUs would make that no longer a long-term housing unit?
No.
Or maybe you can rephrase
No.
it. Sorry.
Because you mentioned that if someone had an ADU that was built, at that time there was no such definition as an ADU. So let's say a granny flat or in-law, and they wanted to legalize it, but it was built prior to April 1, 2017. So they came to the city.
But we don't recognize it as a legal ADU currently.
But where they came and they got it legalized, right? They got it certified now as a legal ADU. Because of the definition of a legal ADU is low to very low income, how can this, even though it's legally established, be used as a short-term rental?
Okay. So again, for accessory dwelling units, they are not deed restricted. We do not put a legal requirement that carries on the property title that says no one making more than X amount of money shall ever occupy this unit. There's no formal deed restrictions. We report them as moderate income units because that's what the rent survey shows us. So there's no, I want to make sure that's super clear. We're not,
Okay, I see.
they're not legally required or considered to be very low or low income housing units subject to rent restrictions. And again, sorry if I'm just again totally missing the point, they would still be occupied by a permanent resident, right? Because we wouldn't allow exclusive renting by a property owner of an ADU for short-term rentals. The only time that could occur in a short-term rental is if the resident of that, ADU, the only time it could occur in an ADU is if the permanent resident of that ADU wanted to host short-term rentals.
I got it.
Subject to those, yeah.
But then we're getting in the weeds on the point that ADUs don't have to have parking.
Currently, but they did before April 1st, 2017. That's why we put that date in there.
Oh, that's why. Okay.
Yes, that is why that's the date. That was the date that the ordinance went into effect that eliminated ADU parking requirements. Prior to that, ADUs had to have at least one dedicated space, if not two, depending on their size.
Okay.
Separate from the main dwelling.
It seemed to conflict with the requirement for parking. Okay, so then you were already going there. Could a property owner reside in an ADU established after April 1, 2017 and rent their single-family home as an STR?
Are they residing in the single-family home or the ADU? They can only
The
rent out the
ADU.
residence that they are residing in.
Okay. All right. I don't have many more. 1 second.
So
So
What?
you want to finish up and
Sure.
then I'll turn to Commissioner Gooding?
Yeah. You have a section that talks about short-term rentals not having more than 2 listings for the same permanent residence in the same days. And then it talks about 2 listings available for booking. Only 1 listing may be booked on any given day. And to me, that's really confusing. Could you try to clarify what that means?
Sure. So say you have a 3-bedroom home and you have 2 bedrooms you want to offer for rentals, and you want to have them as separate bookable listings. Beautiful sunny room, whatever, has these amenities, X amount per night. Or you can have beautiful tree shaded room, that blah, 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 right? Instead of having 1 listing that says 2 rooms, you have 2 separate listings that someone could say, yes, I just want that room. So there's a limit on if you're going to have separate listings for separate rooms, you can only do, the cap is 2. The following limitations is if you are doing that, only 1 of those rooms can be booked at any given time.
And why is that?
Again, I think the intent is to mitigate impacts on parking and potentially on neighbors. So having people renting rooms who aren't part of the same party, may not be carpooling like perhaps other parties would. It's an attempt to manage and mitigate.
But could you have 1 person that rents both rooms?
Yes, of course.
So that would be more than 1 listing booked in a given day?
I think the intent is that if at any time the same party be occupying the rental. That's the intent. That we don't have different parties occupying at the same time.
Okay. And
if it's not written clearly, we can work on language.
Okay. And I'm going to get out of the weeds, but I have to ask this last one. So when we go to unhosted stays, all habitable rooms in a dwelling unit may be rented at any given time during an unhosted stay, subject to the limitations on bookings provided in subsection E. So if an unhosted stay is an entire house that has 6 bedrooms, are you going to say they can only use 2 bedrooms? It seems contradictory because it refers back to that same question I just asked you about.
It's the limitation on bookings, meaning that only one party may rent the property at a time. So the limitation is on bookings, not on rooms.
Okay, so if they rent an unhosted house, they are able to use all the rooms.
Right, 1 party could use all the rooms.
Okay. So there's
that's meant to limit how many parties are on. And I say party, I don't mean party you are off.
We get into that later with
group of people who are renting together and behaving very calmly and nice.
Okay. Yeah. I'll stop there because then we're getting too much into things. Go ahead.
So one of the issues I have is about the ability of the public to know who's accountable for the listing and the booking and the people who are staying there. And I know some other ordinances have a specific provision for a public registry of contact information, which if it's in here, I missed it. And my 2 cents worth is that's a laudable thing to put in, is some provision for either your department or the police department or somebody to maintain a listing of either contact persons for the unhosted stays. I'm not done talking about unhosted stays, but if we have unhosted stays, a contact person and or the owner of the property. So when the noise happens or the parking happens, the public has a easy way to figure out who to complain to.
So there is, the notice requirement. So if a permit's approved, neighbors, meaning owners and occupants, on either side, across the street, and then on the whole block would be notified of a permit approval with the contact information for the host and for their local contact person if they're going to do unhosted rentals. So that notice would be sent to all of those people. Yes, other cities have registries that are posted on their websites. I haven't run that past our city attorney in regards to privacy, and it's probably feasible, but I would probably want to just make sure we can put
Yeah, I mean, the reason I
Those
ask
private
is
contact
the
information
reason I ask
on
is
the
that, you know,
internet.
neighbors come and go, owners come and go.
Yeah.
In today's, you know, fully interconnected
Sure.
web space, it
But-
would be easiest to just to say, click, who's, you know, what's the number to call.
Yeah. And
As opposed to having to keep that notice around where the notice told
Yeah.
me who to call.
And police would have that information as well. So if someone was experiencing a disturbance and called the police,
Yeah.
the police would know exactly who to call.
Understood. But apparently, I mean, one of the reasons for unhosted stays to require a contact person is so that contact person
Hopefully have a deal.
is accessible to the public. So anyway, that's my sense on that one. One other. Is there any provision in the current statute or ordinance? I don't think there is for, let me back up one paragraph. For unhosted stays, it is permissible to have more daytime guests than sleeping guests. But there's no provision for parking for those non-sleeping daytime guests. Am I correct? Because I think, as I read it, the only requirement for parking is that there be a parking space for each habitable room that's being rented out. So when it is a party house, in the other sense of the word party, all those non-sleeping guests, however many there are going to spill out onto the street.
So just to clarify, the occupancy limits in 17.35.040K apply to any rental, not just unhosted.
All right, can you run that site back?
17.35.040K, subsection K. So the occupancy limits there that you were referencing, again, are for any rental, hosted or unhosted. And then as to the parking impacts of that, because we've set occupancy limit, a party, as you're describing it, would, by its nature, not comply with those occupancy limits. So again, that would be something police would be able to enforce on of, I see 15 people here and you only have capacity for 4. So.
But the statute says in K that more people are allowable in the daytime than for sleeping. So my concern or question is
4 people per room. So let's say it is 2 rooms, so that's 8 people. So if there's more than 8 people, which again, most parties that are disruptive, I think probably more than 8 people.
Right. I mean, the poster child in the negative sense of the word for these houses is the 6 or 7 bedroom house that's been on the web, on the resident site, which would be 7 parking spaces would be required to get a permit in the first place. Right. So if for folks who haven't, really ground in the details of the ordinance, every habitable, rentable room requires a parking place to get a permit. Right?
Correct.
But then you can double the number of people in that house during a daytime party without having to provide parking spaces for those people.
And if they were renting out rooms, so we can talk about how we would implement or act on an application for unhosted rentals in a 7-bedroom house where we clearly don't have enough parking. But I would imagine that it would be in our discretion to deny such a permit if we found that it could not comply with parking requirements.
Well,
under the ordinance.
So talking about discretion, I mean, the way I read the ordinance is that you are required to find that there are enough parking spaces to equal 1 space per habitable, rentable
on
room.
the property, yeah.
There's no discretion there. That if they can't prove the parking spaces exist, you deny the permit.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. I will open up the public.
I have some questions. I just have some questions about ADUs that we were talking about earlier, Julia. Prior to April 1st, 2017, or specifically after April 1st, 2017. So after that date, if you have a residence with let's say 2 units on it, one of them's an ADU and then the other one's the main residence, right? The ADU cannot be rented out under STRs.
Correct.
Okay. Under what circumstances would it be permissible then to rent out the main structure under STRs?
the same provisions would apply.
So,
What do you mean? If the property owner was residing in the ADU?
right.
Right. So again, the ordinance says that in order to be a host, you have to be the permanent resident of the house you are listing. Yeah, the unit.
Not the property.
The unit.
Okay.
So if the property owner's living in the ADU, they are more than welcome to apply to be a host to do short-term rentals in the ADU they live in. But they would not be able to exclusively rent out their main dwelling for short-term rentals if they are actually dwelling in the ADU.
So whoever's residing then in the...
Yeah. Hosts have to be the resident, the permanent resident of the unit that they are offering for rent.
Okay, so then the owners would have to move themselves into the ADU, and then they'd have to rent out the main house to rent out that property under an STR?
No.
Okay.
They're not talking about property, talking about structures.
Structures.
If you live in the main dwelling,
Yep.
you can rent out a room or part of your main dwelling. If you're living in the ADU, you can rent out part of the ADU. Because you live in the ADU doesn't give you the right to rent out the main dwelling. If you live in the main dwelling, it doesn't give you the right to do short-term rentals in the ADU.
Okay, so the ADU still does qualify for STRs.
If you're
If
living...
it's by the resident of the ADU. So say you have a long-term tenant in your ADU.
Uh-huh.
That tenant, with your permission, could apply to be a host. If it's prior to April 1st, 2017.
But after April 1st, 2017.
If you were established after that time, then no.
Okay, so
ADU would not be eligible.
Sorry, I'm a little bit dense. I'm sorry. So if it's after April 1st, 2017, you cannot rent out the ADU, right? And so then if you are a permanent resident of the other unit, which is, let's say, the main house, then you could still rent out the main house.
Correct.
Okay, but then how did we increase long-term housing in that situation?
The idea being that the ADU, because it's not being rented for short-term use, is available for long-term use, whether it's for rental for payment or for hosting family members or caregivers or the variety of folks that live in ADUs that get housing from ADUs.
Okay.
The intent.
And Sandeep, if I can piggyback on that question, because I was troubled. Where in here did I just hear you say that an owner of a structure that includes a main house and an ADU and chooses to live in the ADU and then rent out the main house
You can
where
rent it
in here
out
does
to
it say they
long-term
can't?
tenants. Because the definition of a host is that it's the permanent resident of the dwelling unit to be offered for short-term rentals. So you are applying as a host, and you're saying, I reside in this.
I yield. I got it. Thank you. Thanks.
Okay, let's open the public hearing now. I have a lot of folks who would like to speak, so we would like you to keep your comments to 3 minutes, please. Do we have the lights turned on so that they're aware of that? Okay, let's start with David McWaters.
Thank you, Commissioners. David McWaters. I live on Humboldt, across the street from what Vice Chair Doug Gooding described as the poster child at 266 Humboldt. And I'm newly aware of this problem, having about a week and a half ago come out to find somebody else's car in my carport. And I didn't realize that I was living across the street from a short-term rental. I would like to advocate for a couple of things. One is that there be, instead of 60 days, 0 days of non-hosted rentals. And the reason for that is because I don't believe 60 days is enforceable. I'm not going to be sitting there with a clipboard trying to figure out how many days rental that house across the street has had. And even if you hire a third party to try to administer this, it's going to be based on the honesty of the host who's renting this place out. So I don't think that that's enforceable, and I don't think it's wise to create regulations that are unenforceable. Also, I would like to suggest a cap on the number of people that can stay in any one of these, regardless of the number of bedrooms or habitable rooms. The one across the street from me is advertised for 25 people. That's just insane. So those would be the suggestions that I would make. And thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you. Dennis Busey?
Good evening. I'll make it very brief. I'm against this B&B or R&B, whatever it's called. But if it should go through, what I am concerned about is the insurance. I noticed, I didn't read it in its entirety, but evidently there's a $500,000 insurance per unit, and I'm concerned about the neighbors. If you have some really wild parties, gunshots, as you all know, in the East Bay, 5 people were killed recently at an Airbnb rental. Next door to me, I had a wacko neighbor that fired bullets into the house next door, one of which ricocheted off my house. And it was a nightmare. So I guess what I'm saying is look into the insurance, get some brokers for advice, but $500,000 is peanuts in today's world. And I'm concerned for the outlying homes, the immediate people that live adjoining, across, and behind, for 100 yards, whatever. Thank you.
Thank you. Lori Laksamana?
Lori Laksamana, you have to forgive me, I thought I was coming to a veterans meeting, but obviously it isn't. I'm complaining about the same thing that the first 2 people were. There was an advertisement. We have 25 beds available. There's parking for 20 cars on the street. Don't worry, if you just show up before 6 o'clock, there's lots of room. They used a picture of a drone taking a picture showing the street. They don't take in fact that it's a very narrow street, Humboldt is. Some of the older houses have barely one parking place. So, you know, some of the houses don't have these 2-car garages or 2 carports or anything like that. And if you follow the rules that you talked about, 1 parking space for every bedroom that's being used, that sounds good. But having 20 beds available for this gathering, it's a little ridiculous. And saying you have parking for 20 cars, just come on and show up before 6 because there's lots of parking on the street. Oh yeah, don't park in the driveways, but it's okay. Not acceptable. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Sharon Boggs?
My name is Sharon Boggs. I live at 236 Humboldt, and recently got the pleasure of having to hear a party that was in the illegal Airbnb that was being used up the street at 266. And I read this, which I'm not going to reread now because Lori just mentioned it, about how forthcoming he was about all the excellent parking on our block. And I just have to say I've been blessed to live here since 2001, and I've gotten to know my neighbors, and I love my neighbors. And we all work together really hard to make sure that we have parking and that we have a good community and that we take care of each other. And it's disconcerting to me that we can have people that choose not to live in the neighborhood but choose to rent their house out. And even if we're going to have a restriction of 60 days, I agree it's going to be very hard to enforce whether that's 60 days or not. And in this case where he's advertising for up to 25 people, how are we going to know if he really has that many people unless we complain? And I'm friends with and I admire our police department, and I don't want to be calling them every other weekend to come for a complaint about noise and a party on my block. It's not our police station's job and our police officers' job to enforce the civility in our neighborhoods. So I am all for people being able to rent a room out if they're living there and they need extra income, or if they'd like to provide an opportunity for someone to have a place to stay that isn't as expensive as living in their own home. But I think that unhosted rentals aren't really fair to our neighborhoods and to our community, because those people aren't going to really be in our neighborhood to know how we feel and take care of us like we take care of them. So my opinion is that we don't have unhosted. And the other issue I have is that if you're renting a short-term unit, or I mean a auxiliary unit, then technically speaking, if you're that long-term rental person, you can leave up to 60 days a year and sublet your place. And what if your landlord doesn't know about that? I mean, I have issues with being able to rent a place that's not something you own And thank you for your time. I appreciate you listening.
Okay, thank you. Thomas Custer?
I don't need to say anything
Okay.
anymore. Thank you.
Julia Babiars?
Hi, I echo the same concerns as a lot of people have already voiced. But yeah, particularly that people would be running their home like a business, like this 25-person house. That's like advertising a hotel, and our town is not a place of hotels. I mean, we have hotels down by the marina, but this area of Brisbane is residential, and it should stay that way. I think the parking limits are, I think the restrictions, all the restrictions that you've talked about seem like overall they're gonna make it hard, if not impossible, for someone to do that sort of thing, like run a hotel. But I was a little unclear on the occupancy limits. It seemed like they were clearly stated for hosted stays, but the unhosted, she ran through it really quickly, so that was the one part where it seemed unclear, and that, yeah, there should be like a solid limit, not, I don't, 25 is ridiculous, so, yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Peter Bockrath.
Hello, it's Peter Bockrath, and I live at 306 Humboldt Road. And I'm a little bit disappointed. I come down here and I kind of expect cookies and coffee. What happened? The last time I was out here, I was eating cookies and coffee. It's not what it used to be. I, like Dave right here, I saw a car in front of my garage door, parked in front of my garage door. But if I had a car and they would rotate up and rotate down, I think that's a lot of audacity for people that are going out and parking in these places that go with it. And we're talking about the parking issues up here. I hardly hear anybody mention. Follow the garbage truck on Friday morning up there. And they're coming from both directions, and there's two cars behind two that have to back up to move by. And you've got all those cars parked on the street. If it were a fire truck, oh my. It does not look very pretty, and it certainly hasn't improved in the 50 years I've been parking up there. But I guess that's kind of the way the future's taking us. You can kind of get used to it. Thank you.
Thank you. Joe Sully?
One more time, Joe Sully, owner of a half a dozen rental units here in town. And I guess part of what I want to know is, who do you talk to about all this? Can I go to City Hall and talk to this woman over here? Has there been a notice sent to the Airbnb, which is 250 Kings Road, but advertises Margaret Road? Just last week I had 3 cars pull up 2:40 in the morning, getting out, accidentally broke their beer bottles in the street. They're not parking on this property. So I think kind of like what everybody's asking here is for you guys to decide whether we're going to remain a residential community with families and kids. I mean, here we are halfway between downtown and the airport. Every house in town eventually is going to be sold. I mean, what's it cost minimum? A couple $100 a night to stay in the city. I mean, they advertise $117 a night across the street. They're full continually. Anyway, I don't, what the solution is. How about parking permits so that us people that actually own property know that we have a place to park when we come home, when our kids come home? And do I understand now that I can actually call the police at 2:40 in the morning and say there's a party going on my private road, and they'll come and do something about it? That's what I'd like to know, who to get a hold of. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Daniel Gonzalez? Okay. Nancy Laksamana?
Good evening, Commissioners. Thank you so much again for continuing this discussion, because I think it's really brought out a lot of people in talking about it and trying to understand really what is at stake. Everyone that I've talked to, there's no objection to hosted owners. We feel there are hosted owners in town that really do take pride and are active in our neighborhood. I'm not going to read this whole thing, but I did turn in my note as well as a small petition that I did, and it has signature of 11 neighbors in the 200 and 300 block of Humboldt. Most of them are not here. A lot of them you are hearing from, but these are 11 additional neighbors that are objecting to no host rentals. The petition reads, we should be protecting our homes from opportunistic owners who do not have a vested interest in our town and the willingness to have renters be a part of our community for long term. No host homes cannot be monitored to keep track of approved days allowed and will create an awkward and adversarial relationship among neighbors and city employees. We want to discourage this practice and encourage people to rent to become permanent residents. We all know half a dozen people who came here to rent and eventually have raised their children and bought homes, moved here or gone to the Ridge or Ridge back to the older part of town. That's what we really believe in, is that people should be coming here and living full time. The people that I talked to in talking this through had a lot of different concerns, but again, the two main reasons are it's removing homes from the available stock for housing, and that's something that's really, really serious here in the Bay Area. We should be trying to keep people in homes by renting to them rather than having these short-term rentals without an owner in the building. Would we allow a hotel at Oyster Point Marina to be self-service and no one on the premise to monitor? I don't think so. On the way home, I was reading Orinda's new ordinance that came out 19 days after their horrible tragedy. Very, very clear. No host rentals. It's just too dangerous. So I had some other ideas in here, but in the interest of time, I appreciate your work on this. Thank you.
Thank you. Jody Borghese.
Hi, I'm Jody Borghese. I live at 250 Humboldt Road. I came home a couple weeks ago on a Tuesday night after work, and there's no parking, 40 people next door, and loudspeakers going on. They're hosting a wedding in the backyard, and this is like at 7, 8 o'clock at night. There's been several times I can't find parking. I go to the street below. I've had times where people have come up to my house and tried to come in my house because they thought it was the Airbnb. I don't agree with the no host. I think that they should be illegal, and I don't have a problem with a host one. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. Jerry Sully. Okay. Premlaw.
Hello again, Prem Lal, Brisbane resident. So first of all, I'd like to quickly address the issue of the ADUs, of the people who go back and forth in between their own unit and the ADU so that they can rent out their homes as short-term rentals while they stay in the ADU and then move back into their house as soon as the rental is over. You have no way of preventing that from happening. You have no way of regulating that. So I think it's a very foolish idea to believe that that's actually increasing the housing stock. That's not what it's going to be used for at all. Secondly, concerning the journal, the article that I brought in at the last Planning Commission meeting from the Wall Street Journal from December, this is a quote that I would like to make note of here. Tech companies, including Facebook Incorporated and Amazon Incorporated, have long argued that they don't bear responsibility for the problems on their platforms, an argument that Airbnb has made in court cases, including over a lawsuit brought by Santa Monica, California, over policing illegal rentals. So let's think a minute about what's going to happen when you start having people who go into these party houses, get drunk, and start fires and things like that and burn down part of Brisbane. You go to sue who? Are you going to sue the owner? What are you going to get from it? And if you sue Airbnb to get remuneration for some of the money you lose, you're going to be hit by a flotilla of attorneys, and they've been doing this a long time. And there's another article, and if you, for instance, do a web search for, quote, Airbnb, comma, quote, sex trafficking, there's a huge number of articles, and this is one of them from just last month. This is from Dade County in Florida. Over the last year, there have been numerous stories in cities across the country of Airbnb rentals being used for prostitution, drug trafficking, and out-of-control parties, which have led to violence and even shootings in residential neighborhoods. Human trafficking has also been found to be a serious issue with short-term rentals across the country. Stacy Rumenap and her group Stop Child Predators has started raising awareness of the potential negative impacts of short-term rentals. She said the new trend of commercial Airbnb hosts buying up residential homes and apartments to rent out as mini hotels has raised concerns with local community leaders about the country as neighborhoods cope with a weekly turnover of transients and strangers coming and going from their communities. Tools like sex offender lists are becoming obsolete as there is no safeguard to place and to stop a child predator from renting a short-term rental property next door. Short-term rental companies have not done nearly enough to combat the unacceptable actions of their operators and guests. If they truly care about the surrounding communities and neighbors living adjacent to their rentals, they need to step up because their status quo has not worked.
Thank you. Barbara Ebel?
Hi, Barbara Ebel. I spoke on this issue before most of you were on this commission. And we started off as from a place of wanting Brisbane homeowners to be able to get some financial relief. And so I'm not I thought I understood this, and now I'm not sure. So if I am an owner, I'm in financial distress, I've had medical bills, my husband's died, something, 1 bedroom, I want to take a vacation, the only way I can take a vacation is if I rent my place out. So I think would that constitute a no-host rental then? Because, yeah. So I'm actually in favor of no-host rentals as long as we're keeping them to like 30 days in a year or something, just so that people can have that relief. Extremely limited. The thing that I'm really concerned about is the fact that as I understood it, renters can be hosts, right?
With the permission.
With the permission of the owner. So if I have actually run into this situation personally, where there was a renter who was then acting like a concierge and renting out the rooms. So it became a hotel, right? So if let's say I'm living in a home and I have an ADU and I can I can go live in the ADU and then I can install a tenant in the main house with the understanding that they're going to run my Airbnb business out of the main house. So, and then I can buy other properties in town and hire other renters to host other rental hotels in town. So I really we started off with the idea that this would be connected to a person's property tax exemption, as their primary residence. I'd like to get back to that idea because I'd really like to see there be one Airbnb per owner, so that we're not getting in these people who are moving in and buying property, installing tenants, to then rent. That's exactly what I don't want to see. I want to see individual homeowners be able to have an avenue for relief if they get into financial distress. And so I'm really, really strongly concerned about this provision for tenants being able to be hosts. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to speak?
Hi, I'm Linda Seekins. I'm going to go a little bit farther than everybody else. I don't like Airbnb at all. I think it's an end. Right now we have a housing shortage, and I think Airbnb makes cheaper rates for tourists at the expense of permanent residents of the Bay Area. So I wouldn't mind if the whole thing just went away. And I think Brisbane probably won't, but I think you could outlaw it. We can. We have that power. I really don't like, especially, as you might guess, I don't like unhosted at all. I don't want to live next door to a motel. My neighbor down the street has proudly announced that he's got a new unit and it's going to be an Airbnb, and I'm sure that's illegal, but he's going to do it, and we're going to have strangers all over the place if he's successful. I really don't want any unhosted Airbnbs. I think that, like someone else said, imagine a motel with no manager on site. So we have something very special in Brisbane. We have a town that's safe. We have a town where my door isn't locked. I can do that. If I leave something in my car and I forget to lock my car, it might be gone, but it might not. And I used to live in San Francisco, and I used to have to carry everything. I used to have to lock my car when I took my groceries up. I'd lock the rest of the car so that the rest of the groceries wouldn't get stolen when I went upstairs. I don't want to do that here. We've got something special. Let's not ruin it. So I'm against Airbnb, and I'm really against unhosted.
Thank you. Anyone else? Michelle?
This is a tough situation, and I think we need to throw the poster child out of the conversation. That is a radical exception to what most Airbnbs are happening. I do think there is a need for them. There are families here. There's a neighbor who lives across the street, lives in a very small house with her child, and her parents come a couple of times a year and stay at different Airbnbs in the neighborhood to be able to visit with them and do work on her house and help out. And that is really wonderful that they can do that, and that's available. And so we've got to find a happy medium. I also know another person whose very income depends on the Airbnbs that she has because she's retired, lives on a very limited income, she can't afford to live in her house without doing Airbnb. And she's a gracious host, and people love her when they come to visit. And so we've heard these horror stories, and they are horror stories. But I couldn't help sitting there listening to everything and thinking, God, I wish I had the same rules for the dog down the street that barks all night. And yeah, people have called neighbors when they have parties at 2 a.m, and it doesn't have to be an Airbnb. A lot of these rules are common courtesies among neighbors that should be happening anyway in Brisbane and sometimes don't. So I think we need to approach it as a neighborly thing also, because I know a lot of people depend on their income from their Airbnb just to make their frickin' house payments. We struggle every month to make our house payments, and I wish I had an Airbnb, to relieve some of the stress of that, because we live in a place where it is expensive to live, and I have lived here all my life and wouldn't want to live somewhere else, and it is precious and it is special, but we need to find a common ground that meets the needs of the people who live here so that they can continue to live here without exposing us to graft, corruption, 25-person parties, whatever, that is neighborly. And I'm sure that as you plow through this, you will find that, and I think that unhosted is probably a bad idea unless it's by particular exception with permission on an exception basis by the administrator of short-term rentals in Brisbane. Say, for instance, you are a widow and you want to go away and trade places with someone for a month, then you would ask for an exception to the unhosted rule and have a neighbor who will watch out for your property while you are gone. There are ways to deal with the problems that we're facing without making us into a hotel town. But Brisbane is a popular place, and I know that if I was traveling here from somewhere else, I would love to stay here. But some of the laws seem a bit draconian, like you can only have 4 people in the daytime. Unless you're throwing a children's party, then you could have 20 of them because they're an exception, And so we need to find a common ground that kind of works for people, but also protects our neighborhoods without subjecting us to being, a hotel town. And I'm sure you're going to find that balance. But let's also appreciate the fact that Airbnb has allowed a lot of people to stay in their homes and make their own payments who are responsible hosts. and enabled family members to come and visit people here in Brisbane without having to stay at some seedy motel in South City or in some expensive motel in the city or at Oyster Point or whatever. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, sir. Oh, did you want to speak here?
I didn't plan for this, but I really liked her argument with reason. It has to be balanced out. 25 people is ridiculous.
Could you identify yourself?
Oh, sorry about that. Willie Chang. So, again, sorry about that. And whatever her argument is very valid with reason, right? Family come and visit. I think with the smaller rooms, the party happens when you have 25 people. That's a no-brainer, right? I do not want also complicated rules where you are understanding the rule, then that's not a rule. Meaning, what restriction? You're just trying to limit 30 people, 25 people. That's going to directly correlate the parking issue and noise. As simple as that. If somebody's doing like 1 or 2 bedroom, how can you have a party? I get it. You might get a party, but we are talking about probabilities of happening an issue, right? So that's all I have to say.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. No, sir?
Hi, I'm Aaron Clevin. I just wanted to, I'm getting into the weeds a tiny bit, but I wanted to build on something that Barbara said. Well, I guess I'll start by saying it seems like we're actually heading towards a bit of a consensus in the room, and just judging by the ordinance itself, that overall people seem to be okay to live with hosted rentals, but not unhosted rentals. I'm not saying every single person agrees on that, but that's consensus seems to be swirling around. And if I'm understanding the question about the number of unhosted days, where it feels like that's an issue of contention, and some folks have even suggested that it should go down to 0. But if I understood what Barbara asked and what the response was, that would mean that if it were to go down to 0, if I as a hosted, an Airbnb host who's, got someone in my own home, and I'd say I've got somebody for a 20-day stay, and in the middle of that I've got to leave town for a couple days for work, family emergency, or even just because I happen to get some days off and want to use them, I've got to end the tenancy. I've got to kick them out, or I can't accept that one, right? It doesn't feel... It does. If it goes down to 0, we're not really fulfilling the goal, which seems to be the goal of making it comfortable for people who are hosted renters who want to who are using this as a supplement to their income to afford their homes and so forth, and to exclude the unhosted. If it goes down to 0 days, it's not really accommodating that first set. It's actually it creates a problem for them that makes it a sort of de facto impossible or much more difficult to actually do it. So that's just something I wanted to point out since that issue is being discussed. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Sir?
Philip Reichart, also resident. I'm also a host, as some of you already know, and I just want to say that I agree with almost all the points of the ordinance, and from what I heard today, even from those voices that were against Airbnb or that didn't like the idea or had a lot of complaints about past behavior, I didn't hear a single one that wouldn't be addressed by the ordinance, including the 7-bedroom house, including the strain on parking, noise disturbance. There's certain things that you can do about that in addition to what is already is part of the ordinance. I submitted a detailed letter, which I'm not going to read through, but I'm sharing some of the things that we as hosts have done. I also just want to say that there are responsible hosts in this city. As I said, I support the ordinance. I think we need to find a solution that is not diminishing the quality of life for other residents, but that allows for that extra income, both for the city and for the hosts, where necessary. I fully am not seeing my house and my rental as a business, right? I don't rent it out full time. I rent it out, as I shared previously, 40 nights or 40-something nights last year. And that was mainly because I was traveling and we took a vacation and needed income for the vacation. I mean, that's effectively what other parties here have shared already. There was a concern about safety and who is coming into those rentals. Again, I shared some detailed thoughts, but I, as an Airbnb guest, I use Airbnb when I travel myself quite a bit. I'm frequently asked to provide my passport, copy of my passport, copy of my ID. And I'm gladly doing that because I'm not there to commit any crimes. And if the city of which I'm staying in requires that as part of screening or having an additional safety in place, I think I'm fine with that. And finally, last comment, enforceability. There is, as part of the ordinance, homeowners are supposed to pay tax. So I have not seen any detailed proposal on how I, as a homeowner, will pay that tax, which I will gladly do. At the same time, I would imagine there be some kind of monthly, quarterly report of the stays that I hosted that I would share with the city in order to then display the earnings and the tax that is due. And I would suggest that as part of that report, I would also detail number of days, so you can enforce the 60 or whatever day limit you propose, and number of guests. So that's just my proposal.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sir?
I'm Dean Goff. I have lived in the 200 block of Humboldt for 35 years. Parking has always been touch and go, and if B&Bs become established there, then it will become completely intolerable. Also, my bedroom faces one of the proposed B&Bs. And I could just imagine the late night, if it turns into a party house, then it defeats the purpose of a single-family house, which I bought in a residential area and not a commercial area. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, the evening's getting late, so unless someone really wants to speak, I'll entertain a motion to close the public hearing. Oh, do we have someone that really wants to speak? Okay, sir.
A long-term resident. First of all, I wanted to thank Julia. She's organized several meetings over the past really 2-3 years to address this issue and give the community a chance to come together and put this ordinance together. You know, I've hosted in the past for several reasons. I have 2 small kids, help pay for daycare, also because I used to travel for my job. I had to leave the home, and when I left the home unhosted, it actually created safety issues because we're not there. We live in an area that's a little bit secluded, and folks would go there and our neighbors would complain. So I would actually prefer that the unhosted provision is kept because it actually provides an opportunity for safety to the community to have someone that's well vetted, like other folks have mentioned on these platforms. Folks are vetted. You know who's coming to your home. I would never host someone. I have 2 daughters. They're 6 and 8. That would pose any kind of safety concerns to either the community or to my family. So I think it should be regulated like it's being proposed here, and hopefully the rules are flexible enough so they don't seem draconian in nature. So I really appreciate that the community and the committee takes the time to address all these concerns. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, anyone else who really wants to speak? Okay, thank you. You have a motion to close the public hearing?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. I think I have, unless you want to.
May I make a suggestion?
Sure.
I think we could get really deep in weeds about language within the ordinance and lots of little loopholes or details. I would just like to suggest whether my fellow commissioners would consider some very broad-based discussion first.
Okay.
I think that will help us so we don't start fine-tuning without knowing where we stand and what we're heading for.
Okay, yeah, let's get a general idea of where we are on this issue. So, do you want to start, Commissioner Gooding?
Sure. I mean, I think that, the elephant in the room is unhosted stays. It's real clear that most folks, even those of us who have stayed at Airbnbs that are hosted, you're just staying in somebody's back bedroom. It's a very low impact thing. The things that seem to be of concern to the public are the obvious ones, but the real ones of parking and noise and quality of life. And that obviously is affected more by unhosted stays than by hosted stays. It's just common sense. So I think the threshold issue that we just can't not agree on, or we have to tackle to move forward, is whether we allow unhosted stays at all, and if so, whether this ordinance adequately limits them or regulates them or controls them. That was pretty obvious, but I think that's, until we get past that, there's no point in any other details, really.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Patel?
So I definitely think we need to make a decision on unhosted stays. The other thing I'd like to talk about in a broad sweeping way is in 2017, the state of California passed legislation that allowed for the creation of ADUs that bypassed local requirements. That specific language of that statute was to create long-term housing. So then to now allow people to make ADUs that bypass certain requirements that the city had in place and then allow the main house to be an STR, I think defeats the purpose of that statute. So I think if people elect to make an ADU pursuant to that particular law, because my understanding is you could still create an ADU that is compliant with parking regulations that's pre-2017. That's not right?
Sorry. If a resident was to come in today and say, I want to establish an ADU,
right,
we apply the current standards, which include no on-site parking. That there's no option. We can't, I guess they could voluntarily provide parking.
Or they could say, we want to create a second unit.
That's the same thing.
And comply with parking requirements that a 2-unit building would require.
Okay, if someone wanted to build a duplex, which is
right,
distinct from a single-family dwelling with an accessory or secondary dwelling unit,
yep,
then yes, a duplex would be subject to parking requirements.
Okay.
Right, and then the ordinance before you would not allow short-term rentals in a duplex unless the owner or long-term renter of that unit being rented was the one hosting the rentals.
Right, but that unit would technically comply with all the requirements for parking and whatnot.
It would, yes.
Right. So my take on it is a ADU that is created after 2017. There were specific reasons why they were allowed to bypass parking requirements, and that was to increase long-term housing. And allowing then the main house to be in a STR, I think defeats that purpose. So I think I have a strong preference to not allow people that choose to put that ADU on their building bypassing the parking requirements and then elect to be an STR.
Wait a minute. So, I thought ADUs after April 2017, you can't have an STR, right?
The ADU can't, but the main house can. Or let's say there's 2 units. There's the main unit and then there's an ADU. Okay. Let's assume that the main unit decides to make an ADU and not have any parking for that ADU, right? They bypass the parking requirements. Then the owner or the resident of the ADU cannot rent out their unit under an Airbnb because they have 0 parking. But technically, the person of the other unit could. But I think that defeats the purpose of bypassing the parking requirements in the first place, which is to increase long-term housing.
So what I'm hearing, if it's okay to break in through the chair, is a proposal to ban short-term rentals on any property with a single-family dwelling and an ADU established after April 1st, 2017. No short-term rentals at all.
I think that based on the spirit of the statute that was passed for creating the ADUs, which was to increase long-term housing, if a owner of a property decides to make an ADU bypassing the parking requirements, then yes, they have then chosen that they're not going to be using their property for STRs.
Okay.
Okay, Commissioner Mackin.
So last year when we first talked about this, my comment was we have a housing shortage. We hear it over and over. We don't have a hotel shortage. I had someone talk to me and said, I'm a property owner. I should be able to do whatever I want with my property, whether I rent it short-term or long-term to a tenant. What's the difference? I'm renting it. I have a right to rent it. If I buy it, I can rent it. You can't tell me I can't. There is a distinctive difference. When you have a long-term tenant, even if it's a month-to-month tenant, they become a citizen of Brisbane. You are providing housing for them to work here, live here, or close by. When you do a short-term rental, you are providing a short-term stay for a tourist or someone who's maybe temporarily working here or passing through town. You are taking away housing that's needed in this housing shortage. So I think we have to treat this very carefully. So when I heard someone say, well, I think it was Barbara Ebel, about maybe if you're talking about banning all unhosted rentals, but I don't have a lot of money and I want to take a vacation, and leaving town might give me a chance to do that if I had an unhosted rental, maybe a week or two. There's going to be one problem with that, which is that because of the liability insurance, the permit cost, everything related, is that really going to be feasible for someone to do 1 time a year or 2 times a year? Probably not. So I think we can kind of rule that out. We have the problem that was brought up of tenants being hosts. I think that's a very, very serious problem we have to address. And I personally would just say tenants cannot be hosts. Let's not play enforcement whack-a-mole. And in terms of unhosted or hosted, so I've been going myself in circles about this, losing sleep at night. How can we resolve this? The recommendation that came to us was for unhosted maximum 60 days. It was based on finding a middle ground between 2 places. So I went, how can we prevent houses from being turned into businesses? If you say 60 days and there are 2-night stays, that's a lot of weeks a year, isn't it? Pretty much the owner, when we say they have to live there in this draft 6 months out of the year, are they really living there? Maybe they're not. And because we know it's lucrative, you have a really nice house and a view, maybe a lot of bedrooms, people pay premium dollar. I've heard some people making serious money on this. So I got to thinking, how can you prevent this from becoming a business, but allow someone that, let's say you do work in Europe. You have to go there for business. And maybe you're going to be gone for 3 weeks, a month. So you go, it'd be really nice if I could just rent my house. I got a great place. And then I'm going to feel like someone's there and it's safe. So I got to thinking, instead of just saying 30 days per year you can do this unhosted, or 60, what if there was a 1-week minimum stay? That would mean instead of 30 weekends per month or however many weeks, you're paring down to how many actual guests are going to be there in an unhosted rental per year. So for a 30-day maximum unhosted with a 1-week minimum stay, you're looking at 4 unhosted rentals per year, right? Most likely. And if you make it 60 days, you're looking at 8 unhosted rentals per year. If I was trying to run this as a business, would that be very lucrative to try to do all year? It's not going to. It's going to accommodate someone who legitimately says, I'm not trying to do this as a business, but now and then I'd like to be able to rent the house because I'm not going to be there. So I'm not saying that this is where I stand. I'd like to hear reaction. If someone wants to shoot holes in it like Swiss cheese, I'd like to hear all the downsides to it. But I felt that was a credible way not only to keep track of the number of days, because as the one gentleman pointed out, are you going to be out there with the clipboard, all the neighbors? Do you really want to be the enforcers and calling code enforcement? And does planning want those phone calls constantly? Well, this was supposed to be 3 days, but they stayed 5, right? I think 1 week might be doable, because I think if we can't find a credible way to make this a viable enforcement, the unhosted shouldn't happen. So that's what I'm looking for.
That's the problem, right? Is enforcement.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say there is a 4. Let's say we do this 1 week, and you can only do 4 unhosted per year, right? What if someone does 6?
Then they have a violation.
But who's gonna know?
Staff is supposed to monitor the websites, and they would know. They'd be given a warning. And part of this is the fines for the violations. And if the fines are not $100, $200, which they're going to go, but if they're very credible fines, make it so it's not worth it to break the rules. Because if we have people who are trying to follow the rules and do the good thing.
So I have a quick question then. 266 Humboldt's come up a couple times, right? I think it's an official complaint at this point. So what happens?
As an official complaint, as you point out, it's being handled through legal and police involvement, and it's like all code enforcement ongoing actions are confidential. But it is being addressed, and it is under review currently.
Okay.
So if I can ask a question to Colleen's point. My problem with unhosted stays, aside from the policy issue of do we ever want them or not, is if we allow them to some extent, how in the world do we actually enforce 60 days or 4 1 weeks or 2 weeks or any of the above? How do we physically, in the real world, enforce that? Do we have...
I agree with you.
Do we hire a whole new person in community development to monitor the website and check? And is the website going to be the only way that people do this? What if I'm renting my house out for a couple weeks a year? I'll probably find a guy who works at Genentech who's on an H-1 visa and wants to flip 2 weeks a year, and that doesn't show up on a platform. It's unenforceable.
Okay, so let me just
really,
counter.
Well, it's really hard to enforce.
May I respond? Yeah. So I got to thinking about this. A short-term rental is defined as a rental of less than 30 days. If I'm going to leave town and maybe I'm going to be gone a couple months, it's business, something I have to do, or maybe I'm going to take a big, long vacation I always wanted. If I'm going to rent a house over 30 days or more, I am putting in a renter. It's not a short-term rental. So I have to find a tenant. And people find tenants for rentals all the time, and they don't do it on short-term rental sites. And if I tried to find that tenant for 30 days on the short-term rental site, they're in violation of the ordinance, and they're subject to a fine. So there is a way someone could rent 30, 60 days. You've got a tenant, and you say, okay, I think everyone's probably heard of where, okay, I'm going to be gone for a month, and I have a house that I'd like to rent it for a month, and it might turn into 2 months, but I'm not necessarily going to let you stay as a tenant beyond that. That's not a short-term rental if it's more than 30 days, 30 days or more.
Right, but you posed the situation of someone renting out for 1 week at a time 4 times. I don't see how that's easier to enforce than 60
I
total
will
days.
agree with you. I'm just trying to make a proposal, and I found that was maybe the only equitable way, and I have the same concerns you do about enforcement, because I don't know how you're going to do it.
Yeah, I think it's going to be hard to enforce number of days. I think we more have to focus on violations as to quality of life, and we make the fines so heavy that it would act as a deterrent so that someone doesn't violate the time restrictions. So we pick 7 days, 2 days, 3 days, whatever. I mean, you know, I think we have to decide, are we going to allow any unhosted at all? And what is the maximum? And I'm leaning towards 30. So I'm.
The problem with having fines be deterrent is you still have the enforcement issue. So you can't get to fines unless you know that there's been a violation, and that requires enforcement. Right? And I don't see how it's enforceable. One, that you're gonna know that someone's staying there for 6 months of the year versus not staying there for 6 months of the year, or if it's 273 days versus, you know, whatever number we choose. How are we going to enforce that? Second, how are we going to enforce the fact that someone isn't renting it out for 64 days?
Right.
62 days.
We're not going to know for sure, and we're not going to know if it's supposed to be a hosted rental. We're not going to know for sure if the host is there. So there's lots of things that we're not going to know for sure, but I think we can put out this ordinance and then, you know, put the fear of God into people to not violate it. And
the definite thing we know about hosted, though, is that if there is a complaint, then they're going to be home. If not, like, at that moment, sometime that day.
Mm-hmm.
So one other idea I had, just brainstorming it, and it's different from Commissioner Mackins, is if we're going to allow unhosted stays, the real boogeyman here that everybody is worried about and justly, or because they can cite anecdotes, is the party house or the big bunch of people house. You know, what if unhosted stays had the same limitation as hosted stays, which is 2 bedrooms, 2 habitable rooms? That knocks out the party house. You still have an enforcement issue. How do you enforce it? But now we put the hosted in the same terms as the unhosted.
That's a good compromise, I think.
Because that will knock out people buying a house for the sole purpose of turning it into a hotel.
Mm-hmm.
But how would you know you run in the same enforcement?
You do.
So you have daytime guests.
Agreed.
And they could just overstay, and how do you know they left and you're using all the bedrooms?
Yep. No matter how you slice it, the unhosteds are hard to enforce.
Right. Mm-hmm. And we've had
but
little resistance about hosted rentals. And I've not heard a complaint about one hosted rental. I've talked to a lot of residents.
Yeah.
Not one complaint. Not one.
But perhaps if you limited unhosteds to 2 bedrooms, just like the hosteds, you might make it difficult for some of the larger houses to even get a permit.
Mm-hmm.
I think the issue with unhosteds is that there is no supervision of what's happening at the property. Your neighbors don't know what's happening when you're not there, and then it's all anecdote, and they have to like scramble to figure out who to call to, and now they're calling on their neighbor. It's like it's kind of this whole thing with enforcement in general. It's that neighbors are basically people that live in town that have a house. They're basically under the pressure of having to now enforce something that someone else is doing, and they don't want to on Saturday when they're gardening call the police and make sure that the house next door is like complying with Airbnb rules. Like that's not what they want to do on Saturday, and it shouldn't be on them to waste their weekends or their free time to have to enforce someone else's actions. Like that's not fair.
But I do want to kind of provide some flexibility. There was a gentleman that came up and said, well, what if he has a hosted rental and he has some family emergency or whatnot? He has to leave. So he wants to be able to leave his guest that he was hosting to stay for, I don't know, a few days, a week while he's gone. I mean, you want some flexibility so that person can stay there instead of him having to kick that person out when he has to leave, right?
Well, I mean, I think that the baseline rule would be it has to be a hosted stay, right? And if he's not there and something happens, when he can explain himself, I'm sure that there's some leeway in the statute for allowing for emergencies. I'm sure if you have a hosted Airbnb stay, you're not sitting at home the entire time that you have a guest at your house. Like, you're allowed to go places.
Okay, but we don't.
I'm just saying.
Okay, yeah, and if we're going to put that in the provision, because I don't think it's there now. That exception is not there. So.
Well, the ordinance says that the hosted stay is defined as a stay hosted by someone who resides at the property. which to Sandeep's point doesn't mean 24/7, means they can go to work or they can go shopping, and
Right.
you know, I mean, I think there's some room for some human flexibility, you know, even for code enforcement folks to apply.
Yeah.
But none of that applies to the unhosted. It's an impossible. I think it's an impossible beast to enforce. Period. Frankly, but yeah, it seems draconian to say, you know, no, and they never. If there's a way to create a rational system.
If I may, there's always going to be some exceptions, like there's a family emergency, someone has to leave. So obviously you go to planning and you go, you know what, this is a hosted stay, but I'm going to tell you that I have to leave for 2-3 days and this person is relying on this, so I want you to know it is now an unhosted stay for these number of days. I'm putting you on notice that, and here's my neighbor or whatever contact person with a signed form that they are willing to take responsibility as the contact person, that those exceptions may arise and we can make provisions for them.
Okay.
So long as they're not extended stays. But again, the limit's up to 30 days. So
That's if it's
Well, no,
unhosted.
that's if you're allowing
yeah.
unhosted stay.
Oh, that's, I see what you mean.
Yeah.
What I'm hearing, sorry, through the chair,
Yes.
so is Commissioner Mackin saying, you know, banning unhosted rentals except in special accepted cases, which we would outline in the ordinance for hosts to allow emergency or unplanned for absences. Is that what the suggestion is?
That's what I hear it as.
So what are we leaning towards? Are we leaning towards not having unhosted stays?
So I'm leaning towards two things. One, if someone decides to make an ADU on their unit to increase long-term housing, that property, both units, however many units on that property, should not be allowed to have STRs. The second one is, I think that there should be no unhosted Airbnb stays. That there should be some allowance for hosted Airbnb stays, and we can work out, like, if there's an emergency or whatnot with staff to create that in the statute.
And tenants, no tenant STRs? Because I think that's opening a big loophole. And I would just say tenants cannot do STRs.
Just to hear both sides of the argument out loud, what is the big down, assuming that the owner knows and expressly agrees, what is the big downside to a tenant doing it?
It was pointed out, I think she left. It was that a tenant could then actually be friend of an owner, and they become, in fact, the concierge of a hotel.
But we do have, if it's a hosted stay, it's limited to 2 habitable bedrooms, and there's a person right there, not 24/7, but the person right there. Is it that different from the owner being there? One of the reasons I ask is there's a whole business model out there, because I know somebody who applied for a job. I won't mention the name of the one company, but their business model is they will incent tenants to manage the ADU or extra bedroom or whatever for a small sort of kickback as a tenant to sort of manage the B&B. And it lowers their rents, it provides for someone to be there and be a host, and it's becoming, it's a known thing. And I don't see a whole lot of downsides to that. I mean, if there are quality of life issues, they get enforced like they would be if the owner were there. So I feel less strongly about that one. But I'm leaning toward Sundip's point that I just don't see how unhosted stays get reasonably regulated without either a ton of governmental resources or a lot of neighbors ratting each other out, which is not fun for anybody, I don't think.
I think the tenant thing was if you have unhosted stays and then you can install a tenant, that's not really a tenant. They can say that they're living there full time for 6 months or whatever, and then you can have an unhosted stay there, right? So then that becomes an issue because you don't really have a tenant. You just have,
Yeah, that's what it was.
So, okay, so I think we all agree with what Commissioner Patel suggested, right? Are we in agreement as to that?
On the ADU
Yes.
thing, 100%, right?
Okay.
Right.
Okay,
I think that's a no-brainer.
We want that. So as to Commissioner Mackin about a renter not being allowed to have an STR, where do we stand?
You just explained it, and that my explanation was not correct. His was, and that.
So your concern is that you have essentially a phantom or a false
Right.
tenant.
Under the auspices of having a unhosted Airbnb.
I mean, suppose the owner supplies code enforcement with a signed lease from this tenant, and
I'm all for it if it's a hosted Airbnb.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So I think we were talking about the confusion was like if you have a pseudo tenant under an unhosted Airbnb situation, then you're basically just having a renter there that's not really a renter, but there to just basically facilitate the unhosted Airbnb.
So that we'd fix that, I guess, by requiring proof of a lease.
I think it's already in the ordinance.
Or a rental agreement. I think it is.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. And also that it has to be hosted.
Yes, I think that's already in
So
the
it solves that.
provision. Okay.
And this is all in the context of whether a tenant can host a stay.
Right.
A tenant can host a stay we require notarized property owner authorization, not just a lease, not just a letter. They have to.
And all the same insurance requirements. And
Correct.
Yes.
Okay, so no one now is in favor of unhosted, right?
I'm not.
I'm not.
Okay.
I heard though thoughts with exceptions for hosts.
Yes.
And those. Okay. So
that's included.
Banned, except host may request exception for
discretion of planning.
There's like an emergency situation or whatnot. Yeah.
And that'd be purely administrative.
Okay, so we're done with the broad issue. So I want to get into a little then fine point. On page H.1.12, that's page 4 of 7, under permit suspension and revocation. So there's it speaks about if you have 2 notices of violation within a 6-month period, the permit may be suspended. And my concern was, what if you had one violation in month 1 and another violation in month 8? So nothing would be done to that permit holder. So I'd like to just streamline it and just say any 2 violations within a 1-year period, just like you have for 3 violations within a 1-year period is subject to revocation. 2 violations within the 1-year period is subject to suspension. Do you guys agree?
Well, I'd like to pose a question that dovetails off that. This permit's being proposed for 2 years. I'd almost like to see it a 1-year permit, annually renewed. A lot of cities are doing 1 year.
I was thinking about this, and my compromise suggestion that you're always searching for is that the first permit be 1 year to see how compliant they are.
Works.
And then after that, we can take the load off of the renewal process, which is cumbersome for everybody.
Right.
But if they behave for a year, then
okay,
great idea.
Okay.
2 years. Yeah, every 2 years for renewal.
Yes.
Okay. 1 year initial, 2 years for renewal.
And you guys are in agreement about 2 violations within a year. Okay.
So before you go on,
Where is
can
that?
I ask you about that? Because it just will solve it. I don't have to come back to it.
John, you know where we're at? Wait a minute. Okay.
So on the violations, let's say you have, and with hosted these may not happen, but let's say you got police called. The owner is out for half a day, and there's something going on, a fight or a party. So the police come and say, stop, whatever. They end up issuing a citation to the renter. And then later, there's a bunch of garbage in the street. Next day, code enforcement's called. And also, there was a parking violation with a bunch of people that came while the owner wasn't there. And we end up with potentially 2 or 3 citations. Are those going to be treated as one because it was all on one occasion? Or are they going to be treated as 3 separate citations?
What you're describing are 3 separate citations.
Yes.
To me,
Yes.
that would be three strikes and you're out.
So you do. And we're not going to listen to pleas of this was just a bad renter and it should be treated as one.
The ordinance is kind of pretty clear.
Okay. I'm okay.
While we're on that paragraph, before we go, I was just confused. This is page H.1.12, paragraph F1. The very last sentence that begins with short-term rental activity, I didn't understand what it meant to do. It just didn't seem to make sense. Short-term rental activity may commence after 30 days or until the notice of violation is resolved, whichever is longer.
I think it's referring to if there was a code violation that has to be corrected. They couldn't use it as an STR until that violation was corrected. So that might take it longer than a revocation for 30 days.
So before the suspension process is done, they can recommence the short-term rental activities?
No.
After 30 days? That's what it sounds like.
We would suggest rewording that section to, so the 30-day suspension would be effective immediately, and then it could go on longer than 30 days. Basically, it wouldn't end. It would be suspended until the issue is addressed.
Okay.
That's what we're trying to say. And I think we don't need to say 30 days.
That's what I thought you were trying to say. Thank you.
Shall suspend a short-term rental permit as long as the notice of violation is open and unresolved. And let's just take
I totally trust you to fix it. It seems sort of inverted to me. Thank you.
I wouldn't look at it quite like Julia does, because essentially it's a 30-day or longer, right? That's the way I read this. It's a bit of a punitive aspect. It doesn't matter if they correct it overnight. No, they pick up the garbage the next day. It's still a 30-day, or longer if it takes longer to resolve the complaint. So that's how I view that.
Okay.
Without any changes.
So maybe it's just
we can wordsmith it to make it more clear.
Okay.
Maybe something like activity may not recommence until 30 days or longer. Something like that.
We'll clean it up a little bit.
Yeah.
So, did you have more?
No.
I was just going to suggest we go down the same, and that way.
Oh, you have a lot more to.
Oh yeah, I do.
Go for
I do.
Go for it.
Okay, so on that same page, under G, permit renewal, under number 4, a safety inspection shall be conducted by Building Department, North Carolina County Fire Authority prior to approval of a short-term rental permit renewal. But going on, I was going to say it should state that the dwellings must undergo a safety inspection prior to each permit renewal. That was my impression from the last meeting. And it doesn't say that. It alludes to you do it one time and then it's each renewal. And then let me find here. On the next page, 1.13, item L, noise prohibition. Shall be no use of sound amplifying equipment and no evening outdoor congregations. I'm assuming the amplifying equipment is daytime, but it kind of is packed into evening, so it sounds like that's not in the evening, but okay in the daytime. So I think we need to distinguish whether amplifying equipment is okay daytime.
As written, the intent is no amplifying equipment ever.
Period. Okay. All right.
That's how we would interpret that.
Okay. And then above that we have letter K, the beloved occupancy limits. Sure.
We just put a period after equipment and then cross up the and then just start with no evening outdoor congregations of 8 more.
Good call. Thank you. So the occupancy limits again, do we want a cap on if we're not doing unhosted,
Yeah, it's in control. I think.
So this no more than 2 overnight short-term renters. And that is with 2 adults per room? Is that what?
Mm-hmm.
So can we say that after that so that it's very clear 2 renters is not the 2 people in one room, but 2 short-term renters, maximum occupancy 2, not including children, per room, per habitable room?
It says that.
Oh, okay. Well, but the 2 overnight short-term renters per room. Okay. Never mind. I was reading in a different way. Parking. No, I take that back because it was on unhosted stays, so we solved that. Oh, 1.14, letter P, the TOT. Host shall be responsible for collecting and remitting them. How often?
We intentionally left that unspecific.
Okay.
So that
I thought you might.
That'll
finance,
be, finance director, yes.
Okay.
Or does Chapter 3.24 give any guidance for frequency or payment schedules? I confess I didn't go look it up.
I would have to look it up. We could do that, but it outlines the basic tax remittance process. In fact, for hotels, I do think it gets really specific, actually. If you want to wait, we can pull it up on the computer.
Sorry.
So where Commissioner Gooding, you talked about a listing of permit holders.
Yeah,
somehow.
One more pitch for a public registry of some kind.
Okay, City of Millbrae has on their website under short-term rentals, which I would highly recommend Brisbane have some sort of a tab that's easy access to short-term rentals with information. Millbrae actually has a tab where you can see all the permit numbers, all the permit holders, and the addresses. So if you're having a problem with something and you say, hey, it seems like there's somebody's not there, you would know who actually has a permit.
Registry, it sounds like you should probably embed that in the ordinance.
Yes.
But
somewhere.
then the actual details of that, whether it's on the web, that's an administrative function.
Sure.
Right.
Okay.
That's all I have.
Yeah, and there's language in the Millbrae ordinance that is
Right.
pretty simple and cut and dry. It says there will be a public registry and then leaves it to y'all to do it.
Fines.
Yeah. So.
Sorry. Do we decide that we want a public registry?
Yes.
So the fines on H1.3 are clearly established by municipal code, violations of the zoning ordinance.
I'm sorry, where are you reading from?
H1.3 at the very beginning of the staff report, page 3 of 4.
Oh.
And it's under penalties and fees for code violations. Well, actually, before that, above it, permit suspension. It says the permit may be revoked. The host must wait at least 1 year before reapplying. Do we want to let people reapply if it's been totally revoked?
I suspect the city attorney would tell us that we couldn't impose a lifetime death sentence.
Okay, that's
I don't know that for sure, but I have a strong hunch that would be the case.
Fair enough, posing the question. So back down on the fines, where it talks about $100 for first offense, $200 second offense, and $500 for each additional offense. And I think these are lenient, considering if someone's posting STRs without a permit, and they might use someone else's permit number just to make it look good, they'd probably be given a letter. Is that correct, staff? You'd contact them and go, you must cease and desist. This is your warning. You're in violation. So they don't get fined just for the warning, because they might not know there's an ordinance. And so the first offense at $100 seems really low. I would suggest that be $500 because if someone already knows, sorry. And for the second offense, I'd make it $1,000 because then they're just blatantly disregarding. And then where it says $500 for each additional offense.
I think what I would suggest, I think the commission's intent is to basically provide a very stiff, the maximum fine. There's certain limitations in terms of under basically a ticket versus a misdemeanor and all these things. I don't want to start putting numbers in here that the city attorney can't support. So I think we get your intent to make it the maximum amount within its category and without turning these things into criminal offenses. So if we can defer that to the city attorney for the final ordinance, I would request that as opposed to us plugging in numbers here.
And all of these require notice process and a hearing opportunity,
Yes.
right? That might help stiffen them as long as we are providing hearing process, but I'll leave that to somebody else.
Yeah. I think the public hearing is closed. Sorry. Okay, any other?
This is just sort of backfilling stuff. To call it a hosted stay, the person has to be a permanent resident for X amount of time. Did we want to do something about our previous sort of chatting about increasing the...
I think at a minimum it should be what...
From 6 months to something higher?
Yeah, like an urban city would require. So I'd say at least 275, which would be the bare minimum.
I would agree with that.
And is there any staff, is there any consensus among the communities nearby as to what a permanent resident equals? I know Millbrae's was, I think it's 275. I don't know what other cities have done.
We didn't do that wasn't part of our exhaustive review of other ordinances. We can certainly do one, but 275 seems reasonable.
Seems in the ballpark, doesn't it?
To land on, yes.
Sorry, I just did like a cursory search of other ones, and it seemed 275 was the number I was going to.
Yeah, they're all in the mid to high twos, right?
Yeah.
Do we want to go back to the daytime guests? That was under unhosted. Yeah. I think if it's hosted, that will resolve itself.
I think so.
Okay.
Okay, I think we've touched on everything. Okay. So, let's see. May I have a motion for us to adopt zoning text amendment RZ-2- wait a minute, am I looking at the right one? I'm sorry. Okay, -19 with all of our conditions.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, next item on the agenda is staff-initiated items.
Two things. One is you're probably aware that the Baylands EIR scoping meeting will be held on Wednesday, March 4th. That'll be open to the public in this room. You're more than invited to attend. And again, the purpose of that is just to identify topics that will be studied in the forthcoming environmental impact report. And to circle back, I apologize, I should have done this earlier, on your denial of EX 419. We're going to have to come back because right now you have the findings that were in front of you for approval, and we didn't go through the exercise of having the commission make findings for recommending denial. So we'll have to come back with findings at your next meeting.
Okay. Okay, items initiated by the commission. So I would just like to calendar for our next meeting, if possible, an update on the Google bus yard. Okay. Okay, anything else? Okay, may I have a motion to adjourn to our next regular meeting of Thursday, March 12th, 2020?
So moved.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.